Welcome back to Open Line tonight. My guest tonight, Bob Mendes from the Metro Council, at-large council member. Thank you for being here once again tonight. We've already covered a lot of ground. I do want to remind folks, this is your chance to ask questions about the city's business, say your 2 cents, get things answered that have been bugging you, that you've just wanted the answer for. 615-737-PLUS is the number to call. We'll get those lined up and we'll take them just as soon as you call in. I do want to ask you about body cameras. Last Monday, I do believe it was right before Jim Schulman came on the show, there was a big meeting about the kind of the unanticipated cost of using these body cameras on police officers and in patrol cars. And the numbers that came out of this meeting were astronomical. The DA was saying he needs to hire 200 plus staff. It was going to cost, millions upon millions of dollars to make these work when it comes to dealing with them in the judicial system. It was mind-blowing. Was your mind blown?
I mean, the numbers were larger than I expected. We've heard for a couple of years from the police chief that he would need a $50 million amount to have the police department handle their hardware needs and storing data needs. And this information from the DA was, depending on how you added it up, between $15 and $45 million a year more on top of what the police need just for the DA, the public defender, the court system, the clerk's office. And that's a higher number than I think really anybody has imagined.
Do you think it's a realistic number?
I believe they have consultants that say that number. I think it can be done for less. I think other cities have done it for less. The consultant was clear that overall cost depends on the policies you set, and when I said 15 to 45, I mean that million more. That's a big swing.
Sure.
And that was using the consultant's own numbers about how you could set policy, and they were also real clear that was for a full 3,500 camera deployment. And any city that's ever done it has done phased-in deployment over a number of years. And so even if those are the real numbers, it's not like next week we need that number. There should be a phased-in period where those expenses could be added up over time.
All right, well, considering what we were just talking about, the budget being a mess,
right,
and then these big numbers, whether it's 15 or 45 or whatever it is, does this mean the body cameras are not going to happen?
Life is about choices. Governing is about choices. One thing that I think will become clear after the comptroller comes to make a presentation in November and as we roll into the budget next May is we've got choices to make as a city on revenue and on spending, and we're going to have to decide the value of that and whether we're interested in paying for it.
As the person who is overseeing the Budget and Finance Committee, what would be your top 3 things that you say need to change revenue-wise for this city?
So revenue-wise, I agree with the mayor that we need to take a look around the way we finance downtown-related things to find out whether there's money to bring back into the general fund. And he already announced the convention center is going to start paying property taxes, $12 million a year. That's fantastic. I know his team is looking for other money, so we need to look there for revenue for sure. And then the other biggest source of revenue is property tax, and then people always want to talk about wheel taxes or hotel motel fees, and the reality is you could quadruple all those ancillary fees that are mostly paid by out-of-towners, and it doesn't bring in enough revenue to fix what we need fixed. At the end of the day, we are going to change the property taxes, in my opinion. For 25 years, we did it every 3.5, 4 years, and now we're on a streak where we've raised property taxes once in 14 years. That's why we've got a budget problem. That's the single biggest reason why we've got a budget problem.
Do you think, though, that continues to push the gentrification of Nashville?
There's actually some academic studies that show that gentrification happens the fastest in low property tax environments, because low property taxes draws investors, which chase away residents. Now, that's a little solace to a family that's trying to make ends meet. It really is. But we can't live in a world where we never raise property taxes again because it would hurt people's pocketbooks. We have to get back to a rational, reasonable way of governing where we every few years adjust the cost to match cost of living and incomes, and this idea that it's just impossible politically to ever raise a fee, and so we go a decade without changing the water rates, or we go 14 years and only change the property tax once. It's nuts. Nobody would run their life this way.
Right.
Nobody would run a business this way.
Okay, so those were revenue changes. What about spending changes? What do you think we need to really cut back on? Just change the way we do things.
Yeah, so one of the things that's little known is part of the way the last 2 years of budget have made it without being in a worse problem is we've cut as a city almost $40 million worth of expenses.
Wow.
And that's been, it's been good things like buy one box of paper clips instead of 2 boxes of paper clips, stuff that doesn't really hurt in the long run. But there's all sorts of cost cutting that we do that hurt the experience of the average Nashvilleian. Certainly anybody who's tried to get a police officer to show up at a car accident, if you get a police officer there in under 2 or 3 hours, especially on a weekend, it's a minor miracle. If you go into codes and try to get a building permit, you wait all day.
Wow.
And so we the almost $40 million worth of expenses have been cut over the last several years. We've cut all the paper clips and binders that can be cut, and we're down to cutting into services. So answer your question, we absolutely need to keep looking for cost-cutting efficiency where we can, because we shouldn't let up on that. And then the only other way to really cut a large amount of cost after that would be to figure out whether there's departments that could be merged. I know some people, it gets very controversial very quickly, but we've got a $2 billion government, about $1 billion for schools and about $1 billion for the rest. There's 2 different HR functions. There's 2 different procurement functions. Are there cost savings if schools and the rest of Metro could get on board with having one procurement process, one HR process?
Well, I also wonder if maybe the school system would run better if there's a way to improve the quality of that.
Well, hopefully both sides of the equation would get some lessons learned from the other one. But definitely, if you're looking for large chunks of money, scoping around downtown and how downtown is financed, that's one thing. I think the mayor's working that as hard as you can. The cutting odds and ends is not going to get a huge amount of savings, and that leaves, new creative ideas like if departments can be streamlined.
I want to ask you about the parking deal coming up in just a second, but first, let's go to Mike. He's our first caller of the night. Thanks for being with us, Mike. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask. He's talking about paper clips. What about the old people? My stepson, they're pipe fitters. They build high rises down there in Nashville. Where is all this money going for the high rises? The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poor.
Yeah, Mike, I know a lot of people who share that same sentiment that you do. If you look around downtown Nashville, there are cranes everywhere. There are buildings going up. Where's the tax money? Where's the investment? Why are we in this situation when everybody wants to be here, it seems?
The answer is really in that last piece about everybody wanting to be here. If you go back to when we got out of the cycle of resetting the property tax rate every 3-4 years like we used to, that was 2005 when it was the last time we were in that cycle. I don't know the exact number of how many more people are here, but it might be 150,000 more people. And yeah, they're all paying taxes, but with 700,000 people instead of the 550,000 it used to be, we need a bigger government. We need a bigger government. The fire department today is smaller than it was 20 years ago. A big chunk of this is to his question about where's all the money downtown. You need to take a look at the convention center and the Omni. And there are some 20 properties downtown who got tax increment financing over the last 25 years. That's part of the rejuvenation of downtown. And I'll use the AT&T building, for example.
Right.
That got built in 1989. Before development, that square block paid $30,000 in property taxes. Today, that square block pays $2.1 million in property taxes. However, Metro gets the $30,000 it got before 1989, and the other 2 point whatever million goes to pay bond debt on the Omni and the Convention Center. And so, and there's 20 buildings like that downtown. It's going to take a decision to turn off the spigot, to say, hey, high fives, we succeeded in redeveloping downtown. It's awesome, but no more TIF loans downtown. And even if we do that, it'll be 10
we
years.
can't just go back and renegotiate those terms.
No,
that's a done deal.
That's a done deal.
We have to look to the
So
future.
it'll be 10 years before the AT&T building's property taxes are back on the rolls. That's the answer to this question. It's that's the price we pay for what it took to redevelopment downtown, unfortunately.
Let's go to Joe now. Joe, you're on the line. Thanks for calling in. What's your question or comment?
Joe?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
To me?
Yeah, sure am.
Yeah, I have a question about. We want to kind of expand the rails and do something with public transportation, and I want to try to figure out why are we not charging for parking at the rail stations to try to build some revenue to increase the rails. So if you can comment on that, that'd be great.
Okay, very good. Joe, thank you.
Sure, Joe. So rail is very expensive, and so I think the philosophy is to not charge for parking, to encourage people to be able to keep the cost of taking trains down, to encourage ridership. You know, in the long run, if the demand for rail were higher than the supply, then I think it would make sense to do that. You know, the reality is to do something that's changes transit dramatically, is we'll have to get back to another referendum. Hopefully one that's more reasonable, hopefully one that makes sense financially. One of the things that was lost in the transit conversation is any city in America that's tried this over the last 20 years had their first referendum fail. You know, there's lessons learned. I'm hopeful we get back to a referendum that focuses on real, legitimate, comprehensive bus service and a rail line, 2 at the most, as sort of proof of concept. And I think that would go over a lot better with voters.
It has almost been radio silence since the referendum was voted down. And I asked Mayor Briley about it when he would come in monthly and say, what's the deal? I say, we're working on it. We're making changes. We're doing things. But there was never a big rollout, never a big discussion. If it was happening, it was still very small. Things like, you know, synchronizing the traffic lights, those sorts of things, which are helpful.
Right.
But it's not a big, you know, traffic plan for a growing and booming city. What's happening? Well,
this is a place where I hope that the new mayor has got some political courage on this. That anything that involves rail that makes sense, that voters will like, is going to have to involve another county. And if we don't have a county that is going to team up with us, if every county says, yeah, I'll build it first to the county line and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be very hard to get rail between counties. The only thing that is really true, the only meaningful thing that's truly within our control would be to transform our bus service. Buses are unsexy compared to exciting trains.
Sure.
But the reality is we could relatively inexpensively have a modern, complete, thorough bus system, and I think that's where the answer lies for progress. But that takes, you know, that was something that previous administrations were unwilling to do. They were unwilling to pursue a referendum that didn't have, you know, a ton of transit that went, I guess, halfway to the county line.
Sure. I want to ask you about the parking deal that Mayor Briley was working on. that he withdrew after a lot of criticism
Right.
and pushback from it. And it was basically to privatize the parking system. It sounds like what you were talking about. We were selling assets off to
Right.
just make the budget work. And he staked a lot on it. It was teachers' raises and so forth and so
Right.
on. So where do we stand with that?
Well, and that was dead on arrival from the day it got announced. I don't think
Why?
Well, I didn't talk to a single council member who was ever in favor of it. And I think the poison on that was not that it was a bad idea, but that it was we were getting the bum's rush to do it in a couple of weeks.
Get it done.
Expressly to support the budget. And if it had not been tied to the budget, if the budget had been balanced otherwise, and we had a 6-month conversation about it, I'd bet we'd do something close to it. The idea that Metro is going to become a tech company to stay on the cutting edge of parking meters
Right.
and apps, highly unlikely that ever makes sense. I think the idea is a good one. I think the council was not going to spend 3 weeks thinking about a 30-year deal just to make the budget work. We were just never going to do that.
So what kind of situation does that put us in now? I mean, as far as parking goes, are there people who are saying, what is the best option? How are we going to pursue this, on a safe speed, kind of,
Right.
and be diligent about it, but also fix the problem?
Well, I don't know where. I mean, I know the new mayor has stopped the previous project. I don't know what his intentions are with that. My sense from having sat through the meeting with the comptroller and the deputy comptroller and the whole staff over there is that we have more urgent things to deal with, and so I'd actually probably be a little disappointed if the mayor was spending much time worrying about outsourcing the parking enforcement at this time. I think the budget and the comptroller and water rates and transit globally is all for 3 weeks into the term more important than the parking.
Even as those revenue sources are so needed right now, you think it's still something that doesn't need to be full speed steam ahead?
The problem with trying to do it on just several weeks' notice for us was it felt very much like we were getting a front-loaded large lump sum payment in exchange for the parking enforcement company taking the risk over time. And the prudent thing to do would be to get details on, well, what if we didn't get a giant lump sum payment up front and we take more risk at the back end? Do we make more money over time? This idea of having a 3 or 4 or 12-month political horizon rather than thinking about the next generation of Metro's finances, that's where it was dead. And I don't know at all whether this lump sum up front is the best model. It could be that getting very little up front but having a bigger piece of the back end is more important to us.
Let's try to sneak in Tony here before we have to take a break. Tony, you're on the air. What's your question or comment?
Hey, the Music City Center, didn't that originally cost around $550 million? And they said they were going to do municipal bonds at 2%, 3% interest over 30 years to pay it back, and that they were going to pay back the city. So I don't understand this $12.5 million. It's not against anybody. Aren't they making regular payments back to the city every year, regardless of any property taxes, or they're saying this is a gift, or now we're going to make an agreement, we're going to give you $12.5 million, or wasn't it the plan set up that way in the first place? And what I'm really concerned about, and I really like this new mayor, and I told your producer, the young guy, that he's a bean counter. We got an accountant as a mayor, and it's probably the best thing that could have happened in Nashville, and now he stopped the soccer league team thing over there by the state fairgrounds. I used to live by the state fairgrounds. A lot of people did. And they stopped the parking thing. They put the soccer league thing through, but Is there a chance that that thing could get stopped? Because that's the rumblings I'm hearing in city government.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to get to that. I'm glad you brought that up, Tony, because I do want to ask about that. We did a nice story about it today. But first, let's go back to the Music City Center.
Sure.
Let's talk about that, because sometimes these contracts are so muddy, it's really hard for the average Joe to make sense of.
Well, and yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm a business lawyer by training, and just to get copies of all the documents and get through them all and try to understand this, it was basically a 3-month project.
Wow.
That I did starting last November. And I mean, the bond documents are several inches thick. So here's the deal. The convention center does absolutely positively not require to make annual payments back to Metro. What the caller was talking about was that there's a tourism destination zone that basically collects sales tax from a certain area that covers downtown out to 440 on West End, and that additional sales tax revenue is used to pay the bond debt. So Metro, the general fund, isn't paying the bond debt. It's these sales taxes that are paying it. But up until a couple of years ago, no money came back from the convention center to Metro. They just used their money from this sales tax zone to pay the bond debt, if that makes sense.
But now somehow we've convinced them, I guess.
Well,
I mean, how did the terms change? And they say, okay.
Well, the thing that got announced a week or two ago was the convention center will now pay property taxes, just like every other landowner. Usually, government-owned property does not pay sales tax or property tax, and the agreement's been made that they've got enough excess cash flow that they can afford to pay property taxes. And the idea is to make that predictable for everybody, instead of Metro going every year and saying, you know, how much money you got, and the convention center authority board members, you know, engaging in this annual conversation. There would be a predictable, we pay property taxes, and then the amount is known going forward.
It kind of seems like a no-brainer.
It does. You know, I've talked to the council members who were in the council when the financing got set up for the convention center, and you got to remember that was done at the worst of the downturn, and almost all the planning was around, well, what happens if this goes horribly wrong? Who pays for it if it goes terribly wrong? And a lot of the council members around at the time will tell you that nobody ever contemplated, what if it's a wild success?
Oh, wow.
Like, how do we share the money if it's a wild success? And so part of this feeling like it's being invented as we go, it is. There never really was an agreement about what happens if huge amounts of money pile up at the convention center authority.
That's interesting, just the mindset of it all. All right, we have to take a quick break. Lucy, I know you're on the line. We're also going to come back. We're going to talk about the Fairgrounds Nashville and what's happening over there, so stay with us.